April 30th, 1789. The morning dawned clear and crisp in New York City. The 33,000 people living in the city flooded the streets as a yellow coach pulled by 6 white horses made its way to Federal Hall. Inside was the hero of the Revolutionary War, General George Washington. He was about to become the first president of the United States.
Of all the institutions that the framers of the Constitution created, the one that was the most novel was the presidency. And I think the reason for that was that there was no real model out there in the 18th century world. So a lot was left open about the nature of the presidency.
At the time that the office was created, most countries lived under monarchies. So they were wrestling a lot in the early days with how to deal with these basic questions of power.
The question began at the end of the American Revolution, when it wasn't certain what kind of government the newly free country would have, or what part of it would have the most control.
These people are professional politicians, but what they don't have is experience in creating a national government. They only have experiences at the colonial or state level.
And the whole thing is one big experiment. Nobody has done this before. This is a group of what could have been little countries, but now are united under a new constitution.
At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the delegates couldn't agree on how much power a president should wield.
Most of the states had presidents who were no more than figureheads. Not surprisingly, when the delegates to the Constitutional Convention arrived, a lot of them had that sort of thing in mind.
The original men who wrote the Constitution did not think the presidency was all that important. For them, the heart and soul of a republic was the Congress.
Congress represented the states, while the president would be a centralized, singular power. A heated debate circled the new position. The amount of authority it received would determine the balance of control in the government.
Well, the Founding Fathers claimed that King George III was an abusive executive. So they didn't give the president a lot of unilateral power. They established strong courts, a strong legislature, and a relatively weak chief executive.
They really wanted the executive to be the agent of what the legislature would instruct or tell the executive to do.
In a world of monarchs where bloodlines determined leadership, this new democracy also faced a unique and important question: how to choose a president.
It was generally thought that ordinary Americans would not know the candidates, would not know who they were. So what would an ordinary farmer in upstate New York know about some candidate for president? Almost nothing.
The delegates instead set up the electoral college system. Each state got a different number of electors based on how many congressmen each had. The electors themselves would be chosen by a popular vote in each of the states or by their legislatures. But tension among the delegates was still high over who would be the first to hold the office. The question threatened to doom the convention until George Washington agreed to run.
One of the things that reassured skeptics about the whole idea of a stronger federal government was that George Washington would be the first president.
They knew that Washington would not try to become king because he had already walked away from that possibility at the end of the Revolution. And so it was that genius for renouncing power that ironically ensured Washington would be the first president.
The first presidential election took place on February 4th, 1789. 69 electors met in their respective states and cast 2 ballots. The winner would be president, and the runner-up vice president. Washington swept the first ballot with all 69 votes. The winner of the second ballot, John Adams, became vice president.
When Washington was elected president, people didn't know what to call him.
His title wasn't a frivolous issue. It was symbolic of the debate during the convention of how much power to vest in the presidency.
John Adams wanted it to be almost regal, His Majesty the President.
Washington settled on a more modest title, His Excellency, the President.
Part of being His Excellency is that you don't have to shake hands. They would bow to each other. But part of this is because George Washington didn't like to shake hands with everyone.
It's not that he had a phobia about being touched. It's that there was a certain dignity, he thinks, that went with the presidency.
Whatever Washington did, nearly every action and decision took on special significance simply because it was the first.
Virtually every day of his presidency, Washington faced, should a president accept private dinner invitations? Should a president attend funerals? No one knew what a president was. And so Washington very deliberately sought the advice of people around him.
He, not surprisingly, thought he needed advisors. So he created this cabinet, but it was the group of people who were responsible to devise policy, to execute policy, to become his closest advisors.
The Constitution talks about executive officers. So the idea that there would be people in charge of the great departments of government wasn't a shock. The interesting part is that Washington ultimately decides to convene his executive officers and to meet with them.
Over time, the cabinet has grown from 4 members to 15, but its function has remained largely the same.
Washington brought the brightest minds of America together as his advisors, as a cabinet. He invented that. He could have chosen yes men. He could have chosen people who would, yes, whatever you want. But no, he brought together people who were brilliant in theory and brilliant in practice.
Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. For Treasury Secretary, he picks Alexander Hamilton. Then for Secretary of War, he picks Henry Knox, who was one of his generals in the Revolution. And whenever he has a decision to make, a policy decision or a decision about how he should do something, he consults all of them.
Washington spent his first year as president in the country's capital, New York City. Congress met at Federal Hall on Wall Street, while the president had an office and residence not far away.
Washington, D.C., there's nothing there. It's swamp, it's wilderness. Capital of the United States had been moving around. When George Washington is inaugurated, it's in New York City, and New York City hopes to keep it.
Southern states wanted the capital moved south between Virginia and Maryland. Northern states resisted the move, but they also wanted the federal government to assume the tens of millions in debt they'd amassed during the Revolution. It was the first battle between North and South, and the seat of government was the prize.
Hamilton really felt like if the national government couldn't take over all these state debts from the Revolution, then the national government itself really wouldn't necessarily have the authority to keep doing what it needed to do.
Washington agreed, supporting a compromise that would swap Northern debt for a Southern capital.
Alexander Hamilton, he makes a deal with James Madison, congressman from Virginia, and also Thomas Jefferson, and the arrangement is that the capital will move from New York City to Philadelphia for 10 years, and then it will go to a site on the Potomac River. So it will end up in the South.
Washington oversaw construction of the new federal city, hiring the planners who laid it out and the architects who designed the buildings. And he had very specific thoughts on the president's future home.
One of the aspects of architecture that he liked was the Oval Room. I mean, he made sure that that pattern was there in the White House.
Those ovals were incorporated into the new mansion, with the diplomatic receiving room, the blue room, and the top floor's yellow room. The first Oval Office would be added more than a century later by William Howard Taft. Washington's days were consumed with the business of the nation, his workday usually stretching from 4 a.m. until 3 p.m.
He actually had more people working for him at Mount Vernon than he did in the executive branch of government. There were 8 clerks that constituted the State Department. The first budget of the United States was about $2 million. The Army was a few hundred men. And yet, you can see in that impossibly remote culture the seeds of something much more familiar to us.
1828. President John Quincy Adams was running for a second term against his longtime rival, Andrew Jackson.
Adams wants the vindication of his policies. Jackson wants to kick John Quincy Adams out of the White House, to revenge himself for what he deems to be the corrupt bargain that cost him the presidency 4 years before.
Jackson was no stranger to a tough fight. He still carried a bullet in his shoulder from an 1806 duel.
Jackson is a dueler and a brawler. Challenges a man to a duel over a remark about his wife. Kills the man.
Jackson was not reluctant to sling mud, and neither was Adams. The press thrived on the salacious copy. There were around 850 newspapers published in the young country, 1 per 13,000 people versus 1 per 24,000 people today.
These newspapers circulate through the mails. People read them in taverns. They read them in coffee houses. Someone sees a guy in the corner reading a newspaper and says, "Would you read aloud what it says about the candidates for the presidency?" And people start arguing about whether they like Jackson or they like Adams.
The idea that the press was supposed to be objective, by and large, didn't exist. I mean, the parallel today is why people watch Fox or MSNBC. People watch cable news to be reinforced in their pre-existing views. It was very much the case in the 19th century.
The Jackson campaign said that John Quincy Adams, when he was American minister to Russia, pimped an American woman to the Tsar.
Jackson is called a bigamist, an adulterer, a cockfighter, a gambler. There is no demeaning term in the American political vocabulary that is not heaped on him.
The rematch drew more than 1 million men to the polls. When the results came in, Jackson won easily, taking 178 electoral votes out of 261. Adams only managed to hold New England and 3 other states.
The era of Jackson is the era when democracy becomes a great virtue, a great goal, and Jackson becomes president because he seems to symbolize the possibilities of democracy.
Jackson's one of 2 or 3 presidents who's entitled to have his own age. A man who came into office with an enormous expansion in the electorate. Now, the number of people who voted in 1828 more than tripled over 4 years earlier. Andrew Jackson invented the politics of us versus them.
If there was any remaining doubt about Jackson's credentials as a man of the people, the inauguration put them to rest. Thousands of common folk, farmers, laborers, both black and white, stormed the White House for a glimpse of the man they'd made the 7th president.
He hosts this reception at which thousands and thousands of people come, and they overrun the White House. They destroy the furniture, they tear down the drapes, they break the windows, and people who remember George Washington, who remembered Thomas Jefferson, they were aghast. What is this country coming to?
He put a stamp on the next generation. Aspiring politicians in his party would say, "I'm like Andrew Jackson," just as political figures today, they say, "I'm like Ronald Reagan," if they're aspiring to be the Republican nominee.
Jackson not only had a new vision for the presidency, he had one for the White House, too. He added a north portico, a driveway appropriately shaped like a horseshoe, gas lighting, even running water via faucets on each floor. The expansion of the White House mirrored the country's as the frontier population continued to push westward and forced a confrontation with the Indians who were living there.
The relocation of the Native American Indians was something that began in colonial times. As American population moved west, as it crowded into the lands that had been occupied by the Indians, they found themselves being pushed.
Andrew Jackson is a man who makes it very clear, even before he's the president, that he's going to move the Indians away.
Jackson was somebody who wanted to just forge ahead. and say it's an either or. Either people join us in the United States in our way of life and abandon their own way of life, or they get out of the way. And that became the foundational idea behind the removal policy.
Big voices in Congress voiced outrage over Jackson's proposal. His rival, Henry Clay, Senator Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, and Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett. But for a president who would purge 5 of his 8 cabinet members and veto a dozen bills during his presidency, more than the preceding 6 presidents combined, the opinions of others mattered little.
When the Constitution was written, everybody expected that the Congress, the legislative branch, would be the most important. It became apparent that one person had a great deal more ability to shape things than what amounted to a committee of Congress. And presidents, but especially Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, they began to seize power away from Congress.
No one did more to strengthen the presidency than Jackson. The president was the one official elected by everyone, and therefore the president had a unique authority, a moral authority that transcended any other office.
Jackson rallied public support, pushing for newspaper articles and op-eds supporting Indian removal, leaving Congress no choice but to fall in line.
It would become formal policy under Andrew Jackson. It would be etched into law by Congress at the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
Congress passes with the assumption that the military would be adequately funded to help transport these Indians to the West. Unfortunately, in later years, that funding would not come about and would lead to severe deprivation.
Think about the fact that of the 14,000 Cherokee people who were on the Trail of Tears heading from the southeast to Oklahoma, that 2,000 to 4,000 of those people died along the way. What does that mean for the history and the story of the United States? I know Cherokee people who don't like $20 bills just because they see President Jackson on them.
Most Americans condoned or tolerated Jackson's policy in the name of gaining new territory. May 1861. Maryland, a border state, was torn between Unionists and Southern sympathizers. Baltimore was a city in fear. Armed troops marched the streets. Telegraphs were censored. Newspapers shut down. And the city's leaders, including the grandson of the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, were thrown into military prisons. The man behind this reign of terror was Abraham Lincoln. He knew that if Maryland joined the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. would be cut off from the North. He would do anything necessary to stop it.
One of Lincoln's most important contributions to the presidency, if not the most important, is the development of a war powers notion of the presidency.
He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, so he's trying to isolate and quarantine the die-hard rebels from all their sources of support and smother the rebellion.
Ever since hostilities had begun a month earlier, the president had been vigorously exercising his role as commander-in-chief.
After Fort Sumter, Lincoln took on the first of his series of extraordinary executive powers. He called up the militia, he called for 75,000 troops, and he imposed a blockade on southern ports. And he did all of the above without the consent of Congress, which was in recess. Unheard of.
His strong-arm tactics prevented leaders in Maryland from voting to join the 11 states of the Confederacy in September of 1861. But some felt he had jeopardized the Constitution.
He's condemned for suspending the writ of habeas corpus. The Constitution says that one of the 2 times you can suspend the writ of habeas corpus is during a rebellion.
The Supreme Court demands that the federal government produce a writ of habeas corpus, and Abraham Lincoln just ignores the Chief Justice of the United States. It was very daring and very politically astute.
The court was not the only branch of government that fell under the sway of the man in the executive office. Congress, now representing only pro-union states, passed bills that retroactively supported military actions like the blockade of the South that Lincoln had taken months earlier.
Lincoln embodies the term commander-in-chief, even though he had less military experience and knowledge than just about anybody who's ever had to practically use that role. He came to it with the briefest of experiences in uniform, a member of a volunteer company in an Indian war in the 1830s.
When Lincoln becomes president, he really knows next to nothing about military affairs. And suddenly he has to sketch out, he has to respond to a number of crises that force him to define, to articulate this commander-in-chief job.
We don't realize that he was the one who really learned how to use the telegraph in real time, communicating with his field officers. He knew what was going on. It changed the whole way the president would be an active participant in a war.
Lincoln was so consumed with his responsibility for the nation that when his son Willie died from typhoid fever, it barely seemed to register. Where one of his predecessors, Franklin Pierce, had been broken by tragedy, Lincoln appeared unaffected.
You would not have known from Lincoln's day-to-day conduct of business in the White House in February and March of 1862 that anything in the nature of a personal crisis had happened to him. But privately, Lincoln was crushed by the death of Willie.
Lincoln worked ceaselessly and could often be found pacing the halls of the White House well after midnight, but he found little impediment from Congress. With the southern states out, there was little opposition, which helped him accomplish a wide-ranging domestic agenda at the same time he was conducting a war.
The Homestead Act opens up the Midwest to settlement. The Land Grant College Act introduces a public component to higher education for the first time. The Pacific Railway Act provides the infrastructure for the Transcontinental Railroad. So all these things happen in the 37th Congress. It's a very active Congress.
But perhaps Lincoln's most profound achievement and his greatest legacy was the Emancipation Proclamation.
One of Lincoln's greatest attributes was his sense of timing. With slavery, he hesitated because he wanted to keep the support of people who had different kinds of feelings about slavery. So he hesitated to free the slaves.
But just like any smart person, he reads more, he learns more, he's open-minded, and he realizes the time has come to end slavery. He changes his mind.
And in some measure, Lincoln encapsulates what happened to the country. Lincoln believed that slavery was wrong, he said, his entire adult life. And many, many people grappled with that as a moral issue.
Knowing how sensitive the topic was, he didn't risk any wrangling in Congress. Once again, Lincoln acted unilaterally.
When he issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, he doesn't actually have any civil authority to emancipate slaves as president, but he does, or at least claims, authority to do so as commander-in-chief, as a wartime necessity.
People say now it had no effect. I don't agree. For the next year and a half, or 2 years, whenever a Union army advanced in the Confederate South, slaves were freed in their wake.
But as Lincoln freed the slaves, the Northern war effort was floundering. With Union casualties at nearly 100,000, Lincoln was in desperate need of better military leaders.
The biggest challenge that Lincoln faced with generals is that they lost when they should have won. I mean, Lincoln really thought this would be a 90-day war, so Lincoln had to look for fresh blood.
Lincoln removed General George McClellan, and as he struggled to find an adequate replacement over the coming months, an emboldened Robert E. Lee, the head Southern general, decided to invade the North. The place? Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. His miscalculation resulted in the worst defeat for the South since the war began. 28,000 casualties in 3 days. The words Lincoln wrote in the aftermath of that Northern victory made the Battle of Gettysburg immortal.
In addition to his political achievements, he's the greatest presidential writer and possibly the greatest writer in American history.
The whole Gettysburg Address is some 250 words. It takes 3 minutes to read. Lincoln understood the value of getting your message out in a very few words.
The Gettysburg Address was the poetic accompaniment that committed the country to improving itself, to completing unfinished work, based on the sacrifices of those who were fighting to restore the American democracy.
Gettysburg was a turning point, not only the beginning of the end for the South, but as a stage where Lincoln presented a new vision of the federal government as the defender of liberty for all. In 1864, the Civil War entered its 4th blood-drenched year. Lincoln's new top general was Ulysses S. Grant, nicknamed the Butcher because of his dogged pursuit of the enemy at a tremendous cost to his own men. The wartime president's popularity ebbed. In the election that year, he ran against a bitter enemy, George McClellan, the general he had fired 2 years before, and who now promised to end the war immediately.
In the middle of a war, it would not have been unthinkable for Lincoln to say, okay, we're simply going to postpone the election. But he resisted the temptation because he believed that things that makes democracy work is that we hold elections, even when the elections are difficult.
Lincoln could now make the argument that it would be unwise to change horses midstream, the horse being Lincoln and the stream the Civil War itself.
Lincoln had this idea of rechristening the Republican Party as the Union Party. He wants the emblem of a unified single party. He sent his vice president packing and allowed the convention to choose a Democrat as his running mate, to give substance to the idea of a Union Party coalition. And that was Andrew Johnson of Tennessee.
So, election of 1864, Lincoln wins, but Lincoln wins no larger a percentage of the vote in the North in 1864 than he had in 1860. After all those incredible accomplishments, after the Gettysburg Address, after the Emancipation Proclamation, over 40% of white Northerners say no. So I think there's an important lesson is that we look back on these presidents and they weren't always monuments.
Over the next 5 months, the war drew to a close. Starved, outmanned, and outgunned, the South fell. The Treaty of Surrender would eventually be signed by Generals Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. As the war was still concluding, Lincoln held his second inaugural.
The amazing thing about Lincoln's second inaugural is that it was not celebratory. It was not a victory statement. He stood up there and delivered a lecture in which he said, we're all equally responsible for this mortal sin that we allowed to fester in our country for hundreds of years.
But there was also another issue. What was going to happen? There were 400,000 African Americans in the United States at the time of the founding. At the time of the Civil War, it had grown to 4 million. By that time, for any objective observer, it was clear that these people were going to have many of the rights that whites would have.
For an angry young Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, the end of slavery and Lincoln's victory were unacceptable.
He not only attends the inauguration, he's actually in the rotunda of the Capitol earlier when Lincoln walks through, and more than one observer sees him glaring at Abraham Lincoln, almost threateningly, and more than one person says, this guy has to be watched.
April 14th, 1865. A shot rang out in Ford's Theater. The president slumped forward. By sunrise the next day, Abraham Lincoln was dead, and the final chapter of the Civil War, the reconstruction of a nation, would be written without him.
I mean, it's hard to imagine. I mean, here's a country that has just gone through perpetual crisis and loss. The country lost the equivalent of today of 6 million people over the preceding 4 years. And now you have the president who has seen you through all of that, senselessly gunned down.
Lincoln would be remembered for many things, but he was also now the first president in U.S. history to be assassinated. And while he clearly envisioned mercy for the South, he left behind no detailed roadmap for the nation's reunification.
Lincoln had a plan for Reconstruction, but he didn't get a chance to carry any of it out. All of it is very speculative.
President Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt share one grave shortcoming. They thought they were immortal, and they did not prepare their vice presidents to take over. Harry Truman knew very little when he came into office because FDR didn't confide in him. And Andrew Johnson came into the presidency completely unprepared in terms of knowing where the administration was and what it was planning to do.
Without a hint at what Lincoln's plans for reconstructing America would be, the country was left in shock as the virtual unknown vice president, Andrew Johnson, assumed power. But one thing was certain: his imprint on the presidency was solidified.
The winning of that war was such a big political achievement that he had to really rewire the system, and he became a far more important president than any president before him, probably including Washington, who was his hero.
Lincoln changed the office forever. He showed that one person could meet the emergency by using emergency powers. Democrats, Republicans are doing what Lincoln did, whether it's Franklin D. Roosevelt and rallying the country for the New Deal, Richard Nixon sending more troops to Vietnam.
With Abraham Lincoln, there's a general impression that only when he was killed did people appreciate what they had had among them. But in fact, publications like Harper's Weekly, which was probably the most popular periodical in the northern part of the United States during the Civil War, said that he would go down in history as the greatest president the United States had ever had.